So, if you like, I'd like to start with your book, with your latest book. We have it in Italian as well, published by Einaudi, and the title in Italian is Crisi, come rinascono le nazioni, and in English, Upheaval. And in this book, you describe very well, in a comparative way, in a very original comparative way, how different nations with many case studies, Japan, Finland, Germany, and United States, and so on, how different nations were able to recover after the crisis. And you also make an interesting parallel between national and political crisis and personal and psychological crisis. So today we are in the middle of a big planetary global crisis. So which countries do you think that will be more able to recover, to emerge best and more safely from this pandemic crisis?
We have some models here. All of us know that in a personal crisis, often to resolve the personal crisis, you use as a model friends who solve the same problem. If your marriage is breaking up, you talk with a friend who's resolved a marriage breaking up. And similarly, national crises, countries learn from other countries. In the current case of the pandemic, there are some countries that are doing well and some countries that are doing badly. Within my country, the United States, our 50 states are much more independent and different than are your regions in Italy. And some states are doing better than others. Among countries, two countries doing particularly well are surprisingly Vietnam and Australia. Why Vietnam? Because Vietnam had the experience of the 2003 SARS crisis. Mm-hmm. Many Vietnamese died then. The Vietnamese government was scared, made preparations for another such pandemic. And so when the new pandemic broke out, immediately the Vietnamese government imposed lockdowns. If someone got sick in a family, that person was taken out of the house, sent to a facility. The remaining family was put on lockdown. And the result is that Vietnam, although its population is larger than that of Italy, has had only a handful of deaths and not many infections. Similarly, Australia has adopted a thorough lockdown. You cannot go from one Australian state to another. You cannot leave a big Australian city. Those are good examples. Within the United States, some of our states have served as good models and some as bad models. My own state, California, is one of the best models because we have an intelligent, courageous governor who acted quickly. States that are serving as terrible models include Florida and Mississippi, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, states in the far south whose governors are ignorant and did not want to impose a lockdown. That's a long answer, but what it means is that there are lots of models for what to do well, and there are lots of models for what to do badly. And the leading model of what to do badly is, of course, my beloved president, who in this respect, as in every other respect, sets the worst example.
So some Asian countries were already prepared some way. Maybe South Korea as well, right? For some reasons.
Yes and no. South Korea had a bad experience at the beginning of a church where there was not a lockdown. And so there were a lot of cases in South Korea coming from this one church. But once that happened, then South Korea initiated a lockdown. In South Korea, it's easier to lock down and it's easier to trace everybody's contacts because South Korea is technically still at war with North Korea, the government of South Korea traces every citizen in South Korea, sometimes for bad reasons, but in this case, for good reasons. It means that when one person got infected, South Korea was able to trace every other person with whom that one person had contact. So you're right, South Korea is a good example.
Yeah, my question is related to the fact that maybe you know that in Italy we are debating if it's best for us to follow the South Korean example or to tracing people or otherwise. So that South Korea could be or not an example for Italy in this moment. Anyway, this is a stuff related to how can we learn from the past in some way. So another question for you would be, as you know very well, 20% at least of our DNA is from viruses. So it's a very long story of connection between humans and infections. So why are we unable to learn from the past? And what is different, according to you, with respect to this pandemic outbreak today?
You have two separate questions there. Mm-hmm. Both of them are interesting, important questions. So why are we humans as a society unable to learn from the past? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. The reason is related to why each of us as individuals sometimes does and sometimes doesn't learn from the past. Reasons why, contrary to our interests, sometimes we don't learn from the past are ideals getting in the way. So we are governed by the ideals. We don't pay attention to the facts. The ideals tell us what facts to ignore. That's one reason. Another reason is self-interest. Even when there's something bad happening, there are people who make money by that bad thing. For example, oil companies make money by selling oil, although oil is bad for the world. And that's the case at present. Within the United States, there are people who say, open up society again. Why? Because we will make money by opening up society. So that's your first question. There are multiple reasons why individuals and why countries act badly. Your second question, what is different about this virus? The first thing to say is that there's nothing different about this virus. This virus is a perfectly normal virus. It's a coronavirus. There are other coronaviruses. This virus is transmissible from person to person, but so is flu, and so is smallpox, and so is measles. The death toll of this virus is only 2%. The death toll of smallpox, 30 to 50%. Death toll of AIDS, 100%. So as a virus goes, this is a normal, mild virus. There are two things that are different. One is that the world's population is bigger than it ever has been. There are more people on planet Earth to kill, to infect and to kill, than ever before. At the end of World War I, there was the famous influenza epidemic, but the population of the world then was less than 2 billion. There were only 2 billion people available to infect and to kill. Now there are almost 8 billion people to infect and to kill. That's one reason. And the other thing that's different about this virus is something not about the virus at all, but about the circumstances. Now there are jet airplanes. In the days of Morbillo and Viola, there were no jet planes. At the end of World War I, at the time of the influenza, there were no jet planes. Now, thanks to jet planes, when a person gets sick in one country, that person boards a plane, goes to another country. We've just learned today in the United States that the first cases of coronavirus were already at the end of January, but we didn't know it until the end of February. Why? Because at the end of January, there were already just one or two people who got on a jet plane and flew from Wuhan to the United States. In short, the virus itself is a normal virus. What's different is more people on Earth available to infect and kill, and the jet planes to spread this virus and any other virus more quickly.
So we became perfect hosts for this kind of virus, right?
We were perfect hosts for this virus and for any other virus, any other microbe, any other bacterium. Not just any other. For a microbe to take advantage of us, the microbe has to be transmissible. When one person gets sick, the microbe will die out unless that one sick person infects more than one other person. A microbe where one person infects 5 other people would spread very well. So smallpox spreads well. This virus spreads well because one person infects multiple people.
Yeah. So another question is, so you wrote a lot in your books about our ideas of nature. And today I see in the debate, at least in Europe, some people say that nature is punishing us. Other guys are going to say that they go so far to say that, to argue that we should become extinct in order to make possible that nature can recover and diversify and so on. So what do you think about our relationship with nature in such a crisis?
What I think in English is nonsense, and in Italian would be fandonie, to attribute will to nature, to say that nature wants to punish us or that we should become extinct. That's attributing to nature something inanimate qualities. It's like taking your motocicletta and saying that your motocicletta wants to punish you or wants to drive us extinct. Your motocicletta has no opinions. Nature also has no opinions.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But what is astonishing for me is the strongness of this fandonie in the public debate that we have today in Italy, in Europe, maybe in the United States. They are very strong for our minds.
Never underestimate the capacity of human beings for fandonie.
Exactly. We evolved for that. So another, maybe some, you could think that could be a fandonia, but in Europe today we have a debate because some philosophers think that the power, the so-called power, so political or economic power, is using fear to control us and to limit our basic freedoms, right? So, but I'm not convinced, because it seems to me that the strong economic powers are those who want to reopen again as soon as possible. And we have seen ultra-liberal leaders like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump that are denying the emergency until the last moment. So what do you think about this debate about the fear and the political use of fear today?
Further testimony to the predisposition of humans to turn to fandonie. Among leaders, some accept the emergency and some deny the emergency. Again, within my country, Governor Newsom of California, the Sindaco Garcetti of my city, those are leaders who quickly recognized the emergency. There are other leaders who deny the emergency. Within the United States, there are some leaders who want to open up the United States as quickly as possible. Until recently, our beloved president. Still now, the governors of the states of Florida and Mississippi. There are other leaders who have some intelligence in their brains and want not to open up until it's safe to open up. The humorismo nero part of me says, yes, oh, you governors of Florida and Mississippi and Georgia, states that tend to vote Republican, please open up your states so that you may have a high death toll and other states can prevail. But don't quote me about that.
It's registered. Anyway, I still remain in the political side. You quoted your beloved president, and I have a curiosity because it's amazing for me. We have seen very inconsistent and incoherent choices on the emergence by presidents like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and so on. But they don't seem to have aroused so many negative reactions or popular protests in the streets, despite the fact that we had loss of human lives we see today in these days in Brazil. So what do you think about the reaction of people with respect to these leaders that denied the emergence until the last moment?
Of course, in the United States, there are lots of people, probably a majority, who disagree with Trump's handling of the crisis. In Brazil, there are lots of people who disagree with Bolsonaro's handling of the crisis. What gets attention is those people who support Trump, because those people who disagree with Trump are normal, sensible people. A newspaper never has headlines, "Humans are normal and sensible." Instead, newspapers like to have articles saying how stupid humans are. And so it attracts attention when a significant fraction of Americans do continue to support Trump. What I would say is wait until November 3. November 3 are our national elections, and we shall see what Americans do on November 3. But I say that with some hesitation because this election already, voting in the United States is manipulated more than you can imagine in Italy. My Italian friends tell me that you Italians, when there comes an election, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to register. Instead, you receive a piece of paper in the mail telling you on this day, go there to vote or vote by mail. In the United States, that's not the case. In Italy, there's a national policy about voting. In the United States, there's not a national policy. Each state and sometimes each county and each city have their own rules about voting. Often, sadly, increasingly often, the electoral officials of a state or of a city raise obstacles to voting by people likely to vote for the party other than the party of that official. Let me give you an example. This is inconceivable in Italy, but in the United States, the state of Alabama, the government of Alabama is predominantly Republican. The citizens of Alabama, a majority of the citizens are African American who are likely to vote Democratic. In order to vote in Alabama, you have to show a driver's license, patente de guida. And you must show that when you go to vote. If you don't have a patente de guida, you can't vote. So the state, I'm sorry, but it's so bad. The state of Alabama, you get your patente de guida in a certain office, ufficio, the motor vehicle office. The state of Alabama closed down the motor vehicle offices in counties within Alabama with an African-American majority in order to prevent African Americans from voting. That was then challenged in the courts. And the courts ruled the state of Alabama must open driver's license offices also in those counties with an African-American majority. So the state of Alabama obeyed. How did they obey? They opened the driver's license offices in the counties with an African-American majority 1 day a month. That's impossible to understand in Italy. But that is the thing that could prevent the election in November from being a free election.
So it's a manipulation related to the bureaucracy and the procedure of voting. But we know also that there are manipulations also in the sense of in the internet and in the messages that we have seen in the web, right? With fake news and other tools, right? Incorrect tools.
Never underestimate the ability of humans to manipulate, either to manipulate voter registration or to manipulate the internet. But spreading false information, the United States does not have a monopoly on spreading false information. One can think of examples in Italy in the not so far distant past when, for example, in 1922 and some years after 1922, false information was spread in order to favor a party. So this is not an American prerogative. This is a human prerogative.
Yeah. About another North American prerogative, many people here in Europe don't understand why the Americans are running to the gun stores to buy ammunition, and why there are armed people in these days on the street protesting against the lockdown. How is it possible? What is going on in this respect?
There are two things going on. One is the immediate impetus, which is easy to understand, and the other is the background of the United States. The immediate impetus is that some supplies are running short, and so some Americans are hoarding, gathering those supplies. They were afraid that if the supplies run out, other people will come steal their supplies. So, for example, carta hygienica is in short supply in the United States. Toilet paper, we call it. And so there are people who have stockpiled toilet paper. They're afraid that other people will come steal their toilet paper. And so they have guns to prevent people coming in off the street and stealing their toilet paper. That's the immediate impetus. But the bigger question, which is, again, very incomprehensible in Europe, why this American attitude towards guns, which is so different from other civilized countries? It has to do with the history of the United States. The United States arose in a revolution, the American Revolution, from 1776 to 1783. The revolution began with private citizens using guns to attack the British soldiers. And so our country began, it was permitted to begin as a result of citizens having guns. As a result, in our Constitution, the Second Amendment of our Constitution, the famous Second Amendment, says that because a well-armed citizenry is essential for a democracy, the right of citizens to bear arms shall not be curtailed. But why is it then, after the revolution, that we Americans have remained in love with guns? Again, it has to do with the history of the United States, which is so different from the history of Italy. Italy has been settled by Italians for thousands of years. The United States has been settled by English-speaking Europeans beginning in only 1608. The United States arose as a frontier. The initial frontier was the East Coast. Gradually, settlers moved west, crossing the mountains, crossing the Mississippi, crossing the Rocky Mountains. Every part of the United States in its history was at one point a frontier, but the frontier was far from Washington. There were not police on the frontier. On the frontier, people used guns to hunt for food. People used guns to protect themselves against outlaws. People used guns for fighting with Native Americans. And so there's a long tradition of guns in American history, right from the beginning and continuing ever since. That effect of the frontier on the United States is paralleled in few other countries. It's paralleled in Russia, the Russian frontier expanding eastwards. It's paralleled to a lesser degree in Australia, but the United States had such a clean frontier from east to west, and every piece of the United States was at one point a frontier. That's one of the big formative experiences of American history. That's impossible for Europeans to understand.
Yeah, you quoted the native tribes and native people right now. I've read this morning that this virus could be very, very dangerous for native people, not only in North America, but for example, in Amazonia region. You have a message or something to say about that, about the impact of this virus for native people?
Yes, that's wrong and it's right. It's wrong in the sense that this is a new virus. No humans have any immunity to the virus. The Pope, educated Italians, have the same susceptibility to the virus as do Native Americans in Amazonia, as do Native New Guineans. That's unlike the situation when Europeans came to the New World beginning Cristoforo Colombo in 1492. Europeans brought diseases like viola and morbillo, to which Europeans had acquired immunity and some genetic immunity, but Native Americans had no immunity at all. And so there was selective die-off resulting from diseases beginning in 1492. Native Americans died massively. Native Australians died massively. Pacific Islanders died massively. That's not the case today at all. What is the case is that not surprisingly, the virus kills people who are weak and undernourished, regardless of whether they are Native Americans or whether they are American citizens of European descent. Poorer people in the United States, African Americans who tend to be poor, are more susceptible, not for any genetic reasons, not for any immunological reasons, but just because they're less healthy, they have less resistance. And that's the reason why it has turned out within the last couple of weeks that the death toll among African Americans is higher, not for any reasons connected with genetics or immunity, but simply because of general level of health.
Yeah. In a very nice recent article, you wrote in a quite counterintuitive way, but I think you are absolutely right, that the best we can do right now during this pandemic outbreak is to think about how to avoid the next one. So what's your suggestion, how to avoid the next one, maybe the big next one, pandemic outbreak?
Well, we know how to avoid the next one. There are two things that we, the world, need to do in order to avoid the next one. How did this one arise? How did SARS arise? How did MERS arise? How did Ebola arise? How did AIDS arise? How did Marburg arise? All of these new emerging diseases of humans came to us from diseases of animals. They were transmitted to us by contact between humans and wild animals. If the contact is by small numbers of people, the risk is not high. When it gets dangerous is when lots of people get exposed to wild animals. If I were an evil extraterrestrial from the Andromeda Nebula who wanted to kill as many humans as possible by new emerging diseases, and if, as an extraterrestrial, I understood something about epidemiology, I would say, aha, what we should have is a place where many hunters go out and hunt not just one animal, but many species of animals. And then those hunters bring all those species of animals back to a big open-air market to which thousands of people come. Well, that is the Asian open-air markets. They were designed in order to spread diseases. In Africa, also diseases spread through the bushmeat trade. The bushmeat trade does not involve big markets as do the East Asian markets. But the bushmeat trade, the closest relatives of us humans are the great apes of Africa and African monkeys. It means that the animals most dangerous to us, because their microbes are already adapted to chimpanzees. A microbe that's adapted to a chimpanzee can easily jump to humans. It's harder for a microbe adapted to a pangolin to jump to humans. But if you have a Chinese market or a big market anywhere with lots of pangolins, as well as lots of other species, and thousands of humans coming there, then you can also get transmission. So the first thing we should do to stop another virus is to close down the markets. The Chinese have already closed down the markets, but the other way that microbes spread from wild animals to humans besides the wild animal markets is the trade in traditional medicines. In China, particularly, there's a big trade in traditional medicines because many Chinese people believe that the sikar of orsi, of bears, protects you against sexual diseases and skin diseases. And so there's a big trade, particularly in China, also in Southeast Asia, in wild animals. And that is carried on not in the open air markets, but by individual traders. China has closed the markets. China has not stopped the individual traders. So the other thing that we should do, another thing that we should do to protect ourselves is to close off the trade for traditional medicines. That's one thing. The other class of things that we should do is be prepared. In the United States, and in Britain, there's an organization called the Boy Scouts. I don't know whether you have the Boy Scouts in Italy.
Sure.
The Boys, they're very popular, and the Boy Scouts have a motto: "Be prepared, be prepared. Sta attento, bada, bada." The world was not prepared for the virus, but we should have been prepared. We already knew about SARS, and we knew about Ebola, and we knew about Marburg, and we knew about MERS, and we knew about Mukapatsa, and we knew about AIDS. We had to expect that there would be more viruses. But we had not prepared ourselves by stockpiling face mascarini. We had not prepared ourselves by preparing plans. Most of us had not prepared ourselves. There's one exception. The country that prepared itself for this as well as for everything else is Finlandia. Why? Why is Finland prepared? Finland had a very bad experience from which they learned. Finland, with a population then of 4 million, was attacked by the Soviet Union on November 30, 1939, with a population of 160 million. The Finns managed to preserve their independence, but lots of Finns got killed. More Finnish children were taken away from their homes than in any other mass evacuation in modern history. And Finland was cut off from the outside world because the Baltic Sea was closed. So at the end of World War II, the Finns decided we were not prepared, we will now be prepared. The Finnish government has preparation plans. A Finnish friend of mine is on a Finnish committee. The Finnish committee meets every month, and this committee considers everything that could go wrong. When I had dinner with my friend a year ago, May, the most recent meeting of the committee was, what happens if our electricity net, rete electra, fails? How will we, okay, so they made a plan. What happens if our financial system fails? So they made a plan. What happens if a pandemic arises? So they made a plan. Finland has lots of plans. Finland stockpiles. Finland stockpiled mascarine. Finland stockpiles grain. Finland stockpiles fuel. Finland stockpiles chemicals. Finland stockpiles industrial parts. Finland spends the money to do it. But if you buy mascarine in a healthy time, mascarine is very cheap. Or if you want to buy toilet paper, normally toilet paper is cheap. But when lots of people want to buy toilet paper, the toilet paper gets very expensive. And so Finland was prepared. Finland did not have to rush around buying toilet paper and buying mascarine because Finland learned from its bad experience to be prepared. In short, long answer to your question. What do we want to do to avoid another such problem? Number one, close the trade in traditional animals for traditional medicine. And number two, be prepared. Devise a plan. Set aside masks and chemicals and fuel so that you are prepared for anything that could go wrong.
Yeah. So the Finland one is the Finland version of your theory of constructive paranoia, right? In some way.
That's right. In New Guinea, in my field work in New Guinea, out in the jungle in New Guinea, so many things go wrong in the jungle. My planes crash, my boats sink, my cars break down, the people give me trouble, the army gives me, everything goes wrong. And so in New Guinea, I've learned to be paranoid. Constructively, I think of everything that could go wrong, and I prepare for it. Nations need constructive paranoia. And we can talk about constructive paranoia on the part of Italians, because you Italians, you're wonderful. I come to Italy each year because you Italians are wonderful, and you Italians are a special people, and you're special as regards your behavior in this crisis.
Yes, I agree. But it's interesting that constructive paranoia. I'm an evolutionist, so it's interesting that it seems a universal trait in very, very different cultures. So maybe it belongs to our evolutionary deep roots. So in the evolution of our mind, because it's a universal trait. And I agree also totally with you when you say that we have to stop trade of illegal trade of animals due to cultural traditions and traditional medicines. But it seems that if this is true, that maybe we have to abandon the absolute respect to traditional culture, because we have also a cultural evolution. So we have to talk with people and explain that maybe cultural tradition can evolve if they are so bad for humanity, for the public interest, right?
Yes, the fact that something is traditional in a traditional culture does not mean that it's good. For example, in New Guinea, when I began coming to New Guinea in 1964, there was a widespread tradition that when an adult died, a baby, the child or the grandchild of that adult, a baby would have the last digit of its finger cut off. And it meant that when I came to New Guinea, there were many people who had lost all of the last digits of their fingers, and sometimes the second digit as well. That was tradition. Should we respect that tradition? No, that's a bad tradition. Another bad tradition is genital mutilation in Africa. Should we respect genital mutilation? No, there are traditions that are bad and there are traditions that are good. Just because something is traditional doesn't mean that we should respect it.
You absolutely agree. I have a final question for you. You quoted Italian people and Italian behavior, and I know you know that you know very well Italy and Italian as well. I read in your latest interview with the Corriere della Sera that you are reading Italian writers like Primo Levi and right, perfect. we have the proof. Great. And you know, about cultural tradition, you know that that Italian were famous as the most unruly people in the world. But in these weeks, we have seen a lot of cooperation, solidarity, national cohesion. So what do you think about what is happening in Italy from an anthropological point of view?
It's very interesting. This was something initially that I did not understand about Italy. You are correct that Italians are famous for disobeying the government. And so when I saw in Italy, in Roma, that people riding on motorbikes, they were wearing helmets. I asked my Italian friends, why are they wearing helmets? And I was, so it's because the government made a law, you have to wear helmets. But everybody knows that Italians love to disobey the government. Why are they obeying this law of the government? All right. So Italians are famous for disobeying the government. There's a story, probably well known to you, one of these jokes about airplanes flying over Europe that have passengers from many different countries, and the airplane is overloaded, it gets into trouble, and so the pilot has to tell the passengers, put on this parachute and jump. But if you've never parachuted, you're afraid to jump. And so the pilot tells the citizens of each country what those citizens need to hear in order to induce them to jump. The pilot tells the Germans, your government orders you to jump, and all the Germans jump. The pilot tells to the Frenchman, a beautiful naked woman has just jumped out, and all the French men jump out. And the pilot says to the Italians, your government explicitly forbids you to jump, and all the Italians jump out of the airplane. So I wondered, why on earth are Italians wearing helmets? And my Italian friends explained to me, Italians obey that law because they recognize that it's a law that's good for them personally. When the Italian government says, pay taxes, many Italians do not pay taxes. Italians would like other Italians to pay taxes, but not I myself, because it's bad for me to pay taxes, although it's good for everybody else to pay taxes. So why is it that you Italians have been quite obedient about obeying government shutdown. It's because, as with motocicletas, you're protecting yourselves, you're saving your lives by doing it. Remaining isolated is like wearing a helmet when you're on a motorbike. And so, although you dislike paying taxes and you cross the street, and as you know, semaforo rossa in Italy is not a legge, it's a suggerimento. Italians love to disobey other laws, but the laws about virus lockdown and the laws about helmet, that does you good. And so that law you obey, but you selectively disobey other laws. That's the interpretation that my Italian friends told me.
So we have to feel the law inside in order to respect it. But I think that seeing what the Italian hospitals and the Italian health system did in these weeks, I hope that many more Italians will pay taxes in the future, because we have seen the effect of a public and general, universal and free system of health system, right? So we hope that.
That's a good point of that. That's a big point of that, perhaps a good concluding point. There are things that I hope we will learn from the pandemic. The pandemic, although it's a tragedy for so many people, the pandemic may ultimately do us good in that we will have learned some things from the pandemic and will change our behavior. The most important thing to learn from the pandemic is that this is a world problem that can be solved only by cooperation among the world's people. Until now, there are world problems. Climate change is a world problem. But people do not take climate change seriously, and the world has not made a big effort to combat climate change. Why? Because climate change kills you slowly and not visibly. The virus kills you quickly and visibly. If you die of COVID, there's no doubt that you died of COVID. If you died or you become poor because of climate change, it may take decades and you don't recognize as climate change. But the world has not undertaken joint action against climate change. It appears that the world may be starting to take world action against the virus. And if so, I hope that the world will draw the conclusion that there were world problems that can be met only by world solutions, so that having conquered the virus, and it's really only a matter of a year or two with vaccines before we conquer the virus, having conquered the virus, I hope that we will then go on to conquer climate change and to conquer inequality and to conquer overexploitation of resources by a world effort comparable to the world effort that will enable us to conquer the virus.